Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the organizing committee for inviting me, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have a very simple topic to talk about, and actually this is a very, very basic talk, but I have to apologize. I will have some overlap to the previous speaker. I will have some overlap due to the nature of this matter I'm going to talk about to the upcoming speakers, and I will definitely have serious overlap to all what you already know. I hope you don't mind. You know, so there's a German saying, simply saying, repetition is the mother of wisdom. So let's repeat some stuff. So in order to make MRI, a couple of fields are necessary, and the most prominent among them is the main magnetic field generating the polarization. We need the B1 plus field to pump some RF energy into the patient. We need the B1 minus fields which are involved during the signal reception process. And to make out of this device, as we can see it here, a real MRI machine, it needs something special, the gradients. And the gradients we are actually going to talk about. So this is the outline of the talk. We will talk very, very briefly about the very basic design of the gradient coil, of the gradients. We will talk about spatial localization principles and the image formation. So this means we will stress a little bit, a very little bit, case-based formalism. We will look beyond spatial localization, asking the question what gradients can do for us. And then we will touch upon very slightly reality. So gradients are not behaving in a way we think they would behave. And well, at the very end, I will share with you what I'm not shared with you. Anyhow, so this is my only question I have to you, just to keep you a little bit motivated to listen to this very exciting talk. If we are talking about MRI, so what kind of gradient we are dealing with? Is it a constant gradient, a linear gradient, or a higher order gradient? And while you are making your vote ABC, I'm simply continuing to talk. So actually we are using gradient coils like this anti-Helmholtz configuration, you know, and this kind of configuration is optimized to generate a linearly changing B field. Oh, let's see. Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, yeah, it will comment on its own. Yeah, very interesting result. All of them are right. Don't feel bad in the first place. So a gradient coil is generating a field that is linearly changing. So if we look into the mass, what a gradient is, it's actually the first derivative towards the spatial domain of a certain function. So if we take this linear derivative, or if we take this linear function and calculate the first derivative, what comes out? Something that could be called constant. But anyhow, so we are using, well, if we are talking about the gradient coils, they have a linear behavior and they are generating linearly changing fields. So for simplicity, if we are talking about gradients, we are focusing only on the BZ components. We are neglecting all the other components like Bx and By, simply for simplicity reasons. The actual fields generated by these components are rather low compared to the main magnetic field. And as you can see, the gradient is a vector field, and well, we have three different components, the Gz, the the Gx, the Gy, and the Gz. So if you see, if you have a look at the making up, so we are using different gradient coils for the Gx system and the Gy system. We are using subtle coils. Those are a little bit less efficient compared to the anti-Helmholtz configuration that we are using for the Gz. So that means we are getting more gradient for a given unit current if we are putting it in. Each individual coil is connected to an individual amplifier, which is steered by the spectrometer. And this allows us to switch, well, arbitrarily in space and time, manipulating the corresponding fields, so that we are able to achieve oblique gradients. We are able to switch any waveform we like nowadays. All right. Let's focus on the bread and butter thing, which is Cartesian imaging. And if we are talking about gradient pulses, we can start talking about these trapezoidal pulses. So this is the switching regime of a usual gradient pulse. We ramp it up, we keep it constant, we ramp it down. If we change the amplitude or the sign, it looks like this. What happens in the field? If this gradient is stationary, the field is changing linearly, And this point where no gradient or no field contribution is generated by the gradient falls or coincides with the isocenter of the magnet system. In the outer area, far away from the field of view, the gradients fall down so that the function is not fully defined there. So that means not linear or not constant anymore. All right, the prime aim of a gradient is to help us to map the spatial coordinates to the frequencies. This happens if we switch a gradient on top to the homogeneous main magnetic field. And if you look into the frequency picture, that means if we simply consider a stationary gradient, we see immediately that there's a relationship between the spatial coordinates and the given frequency. If you go into the rotating frame just by demodulating the signal with alarm or frequency, you see very nicely that the gradient, well, facilitates this very nice linear relationship, and this makes life easier. However, MR is not only about frequencies, actually MR is about phase, and therefore we have to look into the phase just to cope also with all kind of gradient waveforms. Please keep in mind that we are considering that the voxel is not moving at all. So if we write down the phase, you see it's just in time integral over the frequencies. Here you see the individual components. If we go into the rotating frame, you see that we have a multiplication between the spatial coordinate and the gradient function. The spatial coordinate is not changing, is not a function of time because the voxel is static, and therefore we are able to put it in front of the integral, and we are just facing the situation Tweak and Lundgren have faced as they discovered or introduced the k-space formalism. We are able to write the phase for a given isochromat in a very simple way, just as a scalar product between the spatial coordinate and the k-space coordinate. And this is just the definition of k-space, which turned out to be very, very easy and makes understanding of the image formation process very handy. All right, every MR experiment we are doing, no matter if we are talking about spectroscopy or imaging, basically consists out of these three steps: the signal excitation, the signal evolution, and the signal sampling process. And if we just take an usual MR sequence, like this spin warp sequence, you see that on the receive side, we have the k-space coordinates in there. On the transmit side, just for sake of completeness, we have the excitation k-space description here, mentioned by the previous speaker. And you see that in all these individual sub-elements of an imaging experiment, of an MR experiment, gradients are involved. So let's talk about that a little bit in detail. So as a previous speaker already outlined, signal localization can be done by the interplay of RF pulses and gradients. And if you look at this situation here, so if we are at this very time point where no gradient is switched, the main magnetic field is homogeneous. If we move towards to this point in time where the gradient is switched on, the gradient field is linearly changing in space. The RF pulse, as given here due to its modulation AM or whatever waveform, has a certain band property. It allows only excitation within a certain band, and the gradient translates this, excitation band into a slice thickness. And the carrier frequency at which we apply this RF pulse corresponds to the slice position. So that means if we want to excite a different slice, we just have to change the modulation frequency, and the job is actually done. So this is very simple due to the fact that we are dealing with constant gradients. This makes programmers' life very easy. If you look at this simple description I'm using, you have a hard time to understand this refocusing lobe. And just to mention this once more again, if you really want to understand all the details, a more rigorous treatment is necessary, and I recommend just reading John Pauli's very famous paper on that. Anyhow, so we mastered already the excitation. We have transverse magnetization. So let's look into the signal encoding process. And for simplicity reason, we just drop the slice selection gradient here. That means after the RF pulse, all isochromats within the object have the same phase. That means we are starting in the k-space pictured right in the middle. If we are now applying a gradient, we know that the phase for all individual isochromats is just the scalar product of the spatial coordinate and the k-space coordinate. So, and this is just illustrated for not applying any gradient. For applying a little gradient, you see that all the individual isochromats located at different spatial origins are getting individual phases. If we increase this integral underneath this gradient, this phase accrual is increased. And you see, by the way, that the signal is decaying, which is another indication, or, well, we know all this, that in the center of k-space we have a maximum of signal. So what you can see that the phase of the voxel becomes a function of space and that the spatial information is phase encoded into the signal. And if we run this for, well, a couple of those phase encoding steps, we are able to run in k-space into the different directions step by steps. So this is phase encoding. Just to make it complete, we switch the gradient and move on to the read gradient. Same procedure. We apply the read gradient according to k-space formalism. You know already that we are moving outwards to the edge of k-space. And if we are now refocusing this gradient, that means if the time integral over the gradient we have applied zeros or vanishes, all isochromats add up coherently, forming an echo with very high signal strengths. We are ending up in the center of k-space. And if we are more applying the gradient even further, we are further dephasing the signal. If the signal is sampled in presence of such a constant or of any read gradient, this process is called frequency encoding. And if we do it right, if we use the proper gradient strengths for a given field of view and the proper sampling interval, we are able to fulfill the Nyquist theorem. And as you can imagine, we can also apply these kind of gradients in a repetitive manner to refocus a couple of those echoes very nicely, which increase sampling efficiency and becomes very important for echoplanar imaging or other fast sequences. What I'm not going to talk about, other people will dive into this in the afternoon. All right, let's put all the three things together. So we start with the slice selection. We have the phase encoding, which is incremented step by step. We have the frequency encoding. And if we repeat this kind of experiment, changing the phase encoding and gradient step by step, we are sampling the k-space. And you know that the corresponding signal is just a spatial or the signal density modulated by the phase encoding terms in which we find this product, this scalar product between the spatial coordinates and the k-space coordinates very nicely. Well, summed over the entire volume. And looking at this formula, you easily see that an inverse Fourier transform from these sampled data gives us the desired image. So actually, this is spin warp imaging. So what we learned from this session so far, gradients span the k-space. And the k-space is the space in which simply signal sampling is done. The gradients can be run in different waveforms to form different k-space trajectories, and you can think of any k-space trajectory you like. And what's important and interesting to note that the gradient amplitude is just the velocity, just the speed at which we run through k-space. We know all this bread and butter type of sequence, the Cartesian spin warp scheme. Radial is facilitated by appropriate gradient switching, spiral imaging, propeller imaging, and all kind of stuff, all having some pros and cons with respect to clinical applications. We won't dive into this very much here. All right, so far we have understood how the image is formed and how we are able to use gradients to, well, encode spatial information. So is there anything else gradients can do for us? And in order to answer this question, we have to have a look at the signal evolution once more again. And I guess you already remember, or you know already what we are going to talk about. Now we consider non-stationary voxels. That means the phase integral we posed at the beginning is a little bit more complicated because this coordinate becomes a function of time. However, if we are expanding or if we are mimicking or if we are trying to describe the temporal behavior of a given voxel by means of a Taylor expansion, we can write up it in this way, and those parameters, the R0, the V0, and the A0, are constants, are stationary, or can be assumed to be stationary. And therefore, these stationary and constant values could be, are not dependent on time anymore, and could be put in front of the integrals, so that we end up with a very simple and handy type of approach or formula. We see that the final gradient uptake is just, well, the sum of the individual gradient moments, m0, m1, m2, multiplied by the coefficient, by the corresponding coefficients. So this actually is a static gradient moment, which is a k-space coordinate. This is the first moment that facilitates flow, or it describes the impact of flow, and this is the second moment, which is related to acceleration. To put it in a nutshell, what we see immediately that the phase of a voxel is somehow influenced by motion, and this results into a potential artifact. If we understand an artifact, we can think about compensating it. On the other hand, as always in an MRI, artifacts have also a good side, because they are a source of information, and if we are using them properly, and in this case we can do this, then we are able to get some information. That means we are able to measure flow and acceleration. Let's dive first of all into the moment compensation kind of thing to do some motion compensation. This is the phase of a given voxel. Here the zeros and the first moment. This is a normal gradient waveform. And if we calculate the individual moments, you see that the zeros and first moment is not vanishing. If you take this waveform and add to this waveform its opposed or inverted one, then you are nulling the zeros moment. Everyone knows this. The first moment is still there. If you repeat the same procedure, you take this waveform, invert it, and add it to the previous one, you see that we have nulled the zeros in the first moment. And that's very interesting. That makes the sequence insensitive against motion, or better, against flow. Whatever flow velocities V0 we have in the object, this moment does not contribute to the Nether phase. However, we have to, so this allows us to do flow compensation in all three dimensions. That means in the slice selection direction, in the phase encoding and the read direction, and this helps us in clinical imaging significantly to get rid of flow ghosts. But on the other hand, it's worth to note that we are only able to compensate for a certain point in time. Only for one point in time we are able to achieve this moment nulling. And it's obvious that we take the echo time where most of the energy in the signal space is concentrated. All right, let's talk briefly about flow encoding. So this is a gradient that has no net moment. That means no net k moment, so no zeros moment, but a finite first moment. And if we perform, well, usually if we perform an experiment, we have some background phase and some first order or first moment introduced phase if there is some flow present. If we do two experiments while we are inverting the two flow gradients as shown on the graph here, we are simply inverting the flow contributions. And if you simply calculate the difference, you see that the background phase vanishes. This allows us to do flow measurements because you see that the phase difference nicely corresponds to the flow velocity. You have to meet some constraints. You have to think about your VENC, your maximum flow encoding value, because this is a periodic function. You have to think a little bit about, but while you're doing this, you see immediately that you are very nicely able to measure flow quantitatively. If you are increasing these kind of bipolar gradients quite substantially, we are able to approach very, very small dimensions and very, very slow flow. That means using the gradients, we are able to achieve macroscopic scales, and we are able to sense diffusion. So in that way, we are measuring the loss of coherence caused by Brownian motion. And this is very nicely described by a very old formula proposed by Stacy Altana already, well, ages ago, where you see that the signal intensity in case of applying these diffusion sensitizing gradients is modulated by the apparent diffusion coefficient. And usually we use this word apparent, and we take this very seriously because the theory of diffusion is very, very complicated. And this is just a very simple example to measure diffusion. On the other hand, as you can see, we are able, by doing a couple of these experiments with different B values, to obtain very nice ADC maps, and those are very important for clinical diagnosis. Furthermore, we are able to use the gradients to measure motion, flow, vibrations. And if we are externally coupled into the object of interest external vibrations, and if we do a phase contrast experiment which is synchronized to this waveform, we are easily able to measure via phase contrast MRI the wavelengths inside the patient. And based on the wavelengths, we are able to estimate stiffness, which is an interesting parameter to characterize fibrosis. So all what we are doing right here, so we are adding on top of the spatial resolution additional information that can be encoded by the help of gradients. And all of us know that we have many situations in our MR life where we have to get rid of signal. So this is especially in spoiling transverse coherences within steady state free precession sequences or other type of sequences, or in the magnetization preparation. And here gradients are very much of help. And we have already discussed this at the beginning. You see very nicely, if you are applying a gradient as a function of time, the signal decays. If diffusion and flow is furthermore involved, the signal can't be focused in the upcoming experiments, and you have to make sure that no refocusing can take place. And if you do this, you are able to select the coherences you are interested in, or you are able to spoil transverse magnetization completely. So this is a little example how we are doing this in everyday's practice in FLASH, FFE, or gradient echo sequences. We are just adding a little spoiling at the end. All right, question, are we living in a perfect world? And the answer is very simple, no. Gradients, like magnets, like RF coils, have to obey the Maxwell laws. And if you look into the warm bore of a magnet where no currents are flowing, the gradients or the field generated by the gradients have to fulfill these two basic Maxwell equations. And what that means is simple. If we switch a gradient, here in this particular case a GZ gradient, we have also gradient in the Bx and By direction that we usually neglect. What does it mean? These concomitant Maxwell terms, present, are modulating or are influencing the effective B naught. And the magnetization is always precessing around the effective B naught. And if we have these additional terms, you might imagine that this effective field is a little bit tilted, and that transverse magnetization acquires additional phase. And this is especially important in any phase-sensitive measurement and have to be considered. And the good news is we are able to very, very precisely describe this. So this is no rocket science. It's a very simple formula given here. And no, it's a very tedious formula, but it's basically very simple. And you can see that it depends on the B naught field strength. That means for low field systems, these concomitant Maxwell gradients are really a problem. For 7 Tesla or even ultra-high field system, it's not a serious problem. And it's independent on the polarity of the gradient you are switching, because you see the gradients are given here always in positive definite ways. All right. Another point of reality, we have to envision that the gradients are a complicated structure. They consist sort of coils, amplifiers, drivers, logic, and all kind of stuff which are working together in a certain kind of synergy. And we are achieving peak powers in the order of megawatt, and we are asking for accuracies better than 10 power minus 5, approaching 10 power minus 6. So just saying this, even if gradients are always blamed, they are high-tech products, and they pretty much contribute to the costs of a NAMOS system. And in designing these kind of systems, we have to consider a couple of issues: the performance, the maximum gradient, the slew rate, the efficiency, how much field we are getting out of a coil, the duty cycle, how much power the coil is able to stand, the eddy currents, we have to minimize them, the mechanical stability, acoustic noise, cooling, bore size. Finally, a patient has to be fit in. So that you see there are so many constraints in designing and using a coil, so that every gradient coil that is out there is only a compromise. They are never perfect. We took some measures in the past in order to make them perfect. Actually, a gradient coil consists out of 2 gradient coils using the self-shielding philosophy. The inner coil of this concentric setup is simply generating a field inside the patient, as you might imagine, but also a field that goes into the cryostat, generating or triggering some very long-lasting eddy currents. The outer coil, which is also actually a gradient coil, is counteracting that with the aim to try to get to cancel the fields of the inner coil inside the cryostat. You can imagine, so that with this anti-synergetic setup, we are reducing the efficiency of a gradient coil, but we do this in order to improve the performance of the coils. But even doing that, and also applying some linear and cross-term pre-emphasis to make the gradients faster and to cope for residual time constants, gradients are never perfect. We are able to measure this. We see some little slopes, some little deviations from the should-bes, but this can be taken into account. On the other hand, so I want to inform everyone who is in the audience and want to design his own spirals. One also has to consider the transfer function of the gradient system, which is not flat. So the gradient system has a certain frequency response. So that means that in case you are changing the frequency of your spirals or oscillating gradients, you will never get what you expect if you do not mimic it in the first place. Other side effects that come along, and all of us know this, gradients are very bad loudspeakers. Even if they are somehow shielded, it's not possible to get rid of all these interactions. It's a coil within an electromagnetic field, so that it's generating serious noise, causing serious problems, even if we would apply force shielding. But on the other hand, it could also be fun. So some of us might remember the early days where we had this sound and vision program where people were making music with the gradients. You could consider giving instructions to the patient via the gradients, hold your breath and things like that. You can make lots of fun, but it's a very expensive loudspeaker. Yes, that's correct. On the other hand, you have to consider that also some physiological effects are obvious. Gradients or high switching rate gradients can provoke peripheral nerve stimulation, and this is a serious problem because it's very painful for the patient, and it puts some limits to the slew rate that we have to meet. So, but to wrap up a little bit, there are even more gradients in the world, and there are gradients I have not talked about. So with respect to the Binord field, there are higher order shims, and they are very, very essential in our days to achieve good spectra and also to achieve good fMRI images. And to a certain extent, these higher order shims are also gradients. Furthermore, there are higher and very local gradients in use or in academic under academic investigations. And those are also very, very interesting because they give us an even higher encoding capability than the normal constant gradients can do. And on the other hand, they could represent a workaround for the problem of nerve stimulation because they are acting very, very locally. We haven't talked about the gradients in the transmit field. So there is an old method like rotating frame imaging that is based on B1 gradients, and also in the advent of parallel transmit, one can envision to think about transmit gradients very, very nicely. And on the other hand, so B1 comes also with B1 minus. We can think about forming gradients by means of a certain and smart superposition of received coil elements during parallel reception. We have not talked about this, but all these are very, very interesting subjects. So thank you for your attention. So I have to quit my presentation. I want to thank Johan, a colleague of mine who borrowed me some slides, and I want to thank Chen Lin, who gave this talk last year. And thank you very much.